Welcome to Paying Attention with me, Nicholas Gruen, and my friend Peyton Bowman. We spend this time every week thinking through issues that are important to us, often in real time. We're not afraid to say things that we think, but we're not sure, and we try and work it out. So I'll now hand over to Peyton and we'll get going.
So hi, everyone. This is Peyton, and looking forward to another great discussion with you, Nicholas. So this week is a little bit of a continuation of a conversation we had last week in our last episode, but I would like to kick this off by bringing up a recent event. So, this past week, Elon Musk went on to Twitter and he asked people what they thought about Twitter. Does it protect free speech? Do we need a new platform? And there was quite a big response that said, there were a lot of people who said, yes, we need free speech on Twitter. Elon Musk, you should buy Twitter or you should make your own Twitter. But in all this discussion, the big question is free speech going to be enough? What is actually required of a platform to have a very good and engaging discussion that leads to healthy democracy? So I kind of wanted to bring that up as a kind of base example of something. But what do you think, Nicholas? What would we need to really have a good social media platform, and how might it be informed by some of the concepts we talked about last week, which you see on this slide?
Yeah, so I think, so I see this is a sort of recurring pattern. People get unhappy with things and like our democracy is set up as if we're all rather unsatisfied customers turning up at a shop to return shoddy goods. The customer the shop owner, of course, understands the first rule of shop owners, which is the first rule of politicians, which is that the customer is always right. So they don't say, well, actually, if I'd served you up anything else, you wouldn't have bought it. They say, yes, of course, and they carry on and say the customer is always right. So obviously, it's easy for Elon Musk, clever fellow that he is, to think that what we need is a new platform. And this reminds me of people constantly saying what we need is a new political party. And they don't dwell for very long on the idea that maybe if they had developed a new platform or a new political party, that the kinds of structural forces that are making them unhappy with the existing offerings would happen to their offerings. So we have a deep problem, and maybe we'll explore. Maybe we'll be able to kind of move up to some of these thoughts, but one way into it is to sort of think about it from Twitter's point of view, and Twitter certainly didn't start out wanting to censor anyone, and then essentially if you're seeking attention, there are certain rules to maximize engagement, to be most outrageous. If you're seeking to purvey disinformation, there are lots of ways to do that. And so Twitter tried to move against those things. I don't want to absolve Twitter from the fact that it has a certain ideological slant to the way in which it's behaving. Likewise, when Google sacked James Damore, I think was his name, for circulating a 12-page closely reasoned argument, which you may want to agree with or disagree with, but it was argued in good faith about the best way to deal with the question that there were far fewer women coders than men. And he was sacked, really because it became a PR headache for Google, both internally and externally. So I can hardly say that that's a good thing. In fact, I think that is an utterly outrageous thing. But Twitter but both of these companies, I think what Google did in that situation is completely outrageous. I'm much more sympathetic to Twitter because I think the problem that Twitter has is a much more difficult problem to solve. And in fact, the ideas that we explored last week, and there were 4 simple concepts, and we got through 3 of them. This is probably a good opportunity. You've got them up on the screen there, to reprise them, because they can help us. We dealt last week with isegoria, that line along the bottom, parhesia, the vertical, the concept that I've illustrated there vertically, and fidelity. And we can talk about those things and the 4th one, and we can keep this question of the dilemmas faced by Twitter, the dilemma faced by people who get deplatformed by Twitter, rightly and wrongly. We can keep all those things in mind as trying to keep very concrete how we understand some of these principles. And to just put it very quickly, these principles, we have some corresponding principles in our own political lexicon, our own modern political mind. These are principles from ancient Athens, political principles from ancient Athens. So they're similar, but profoundly different in certain ways. And that gives us a lot to learn about in terms of what is absent from our ideas.
Well, I mean, last week you were talking about how isegoria is equality of speech, and parhesia is sort of the ability to speak. We talked quite a lot about how the dimensions to this. There's an element where it's speaking truth to power. There's also a dimension of where you're also accountable for what you say. But if I'm looking at this, let's say I'm a free speech absolutist. I mean, how can we have isegoria? How can we have parhesia without the ability to the right? As we talked about, the right to speak whatever I want to say. Or is that right not somehow contained in these ideas? Or what is the relationship between the right to speak anything or to say anything and these ideas here?
I think, the way I guess I would put it is that our modern concepts are not relational concepts. They're constitutional concepts. They're ideas that could be put into words, written into a constitution, and then we've all got certain rights. So if we've all got rights to speak, well, that's what we had on Twitter until various things happened, and Twitter tried to solve some of its commercial and political and PR problems and came up with the melange of rules that it applies. But the experience of Twitter on full free speech wasn't a very happy experience. It wasn't the experience that we were encouraged to believe from Enlightenment ideas. The simple idea, there's a good book, which I'll, if I remember, put in the show notes, by Jonathan Rauch, called The Constitution of Knowledge. And he critiques this idea, which is an idea from economics, that in a free market of ideas, the best ideas win out. That's a kind of a very nice, simple metaphor of the realm of political debate as a market, and it sort of sounds right, but it's completely wrong, as we've seen when we get disinformation just running riot. So what is valuable about these about these ancient concepts of isegoria and parhesia, equality of speech, and, if you like, the cluster of ethical ideas around the duty to speak truth to power and power's duty to listen. That's one way to put it. What's noticeable about those political ideas is that they are relational and they are ethical. So the idea of free speech is simply an idea that everybody's got a right to speak. And if everyone's got a right to speak, it turns out that the way we're built emotionally is that, I think you'll be familiar with that very funny if I've got the letters right, XKCD cartoon, which is, honey, I can't come to bed just now. Somebody is wrong on the internet. So we get ourselves wound up. It's very easy to be wound up. I certainly will plead guilty. And it turns out that there are very simple ways you can kind of hack the human brain in this environment of hyperconnectivity and completely free speech. And so this is showing us in a very concrete way that these political ideas we have, where we give people rights up to a certain level, and then we have a judge or someone saying, adjudicating whether these rights have been, whether you're within your rights or not. This is, as I will have done this before in our discussions, this goes up to an apex principle. And it's the sovereign, and we get the rule correct, and the rule's supposed to be free speech within certain limits, and the whole thing is projected down. And what is missing from that is the idea that this is all a means to an end, and the means to and this is a society we're talking about, and societies are ultimately made up of relationships between people. And the idea of parrhesia is the inverse of a modern Western idea, which is everybody gets certain rights, and this has all been sketched out in a set of words that appear in a constitution, and it goes the other way, and it says human beings have an ethical relation with each other, and we will build a society out of purifying and making better that ethical relation. And now it's not true and us false. They're kind of two sides of a coin, and that's why knowing about these ideas helps us understand the inadequacies of the ideas that we are running on empty with in our existing policy.
So, for example, on let's say a platform like Twitter, we might have some kind of algorithm or mechanism where you're not just getting presented the messages by the loudest or the noisiest or the most bombastic people, but that somehow looks at other qualities in an effort to strengthen that idea of relationship between users, and by, in a way, promoting that aspect of isegoria, which is the equality of being heard. Would something like that make sense? Yeah.
So we may also have spoken about this thing, which I take as a really big lesson for us. I call it, well, it's a site that was started in Australia. It's now in mothballs. I think it was called Your View. And I call it the middleware of democracy. And what Your View did was it was a social media discussion site. People just debated different political issues, but it was actually built by a philosopher. He didn't make a lot of money out of it. And he built algorithms to detect what he called epistemic virtues. I sort of send that up a bit. I said, that's never going to sell in the marketplace, Your View with its epistemic virtues. He told me it wasn't a customer facing concept, but anyway. And these algorithms pick up epistemic virtues. What's the point of that? So that the people who other people feel have most to say, are most constructive, or whose contributions they most value are promoted in this social media. Now that's a kind of constructed equality of speech. So anyone has the right to turn up and to say what they have to say, and then the point of this speech is to sift out, and now we get our fourth concept, a little taste of our fourth concept. The point of the speech is not so that everybody gets to have equal self-esteem, but that everyone has an ability to put things into this large cognitive device called the demos, the democracy, and it will work out what ideas are most meritorious. It will work out what the best idea we can come up with is, And now what sort of algorithm could do that? The way I explain it is to describe one of the 8 algorithms, which said that you were promoted on the network and given more status if the things you said were well thought of by people who disagreed with you. And I think you, Peyton, and anyone listening will be able to see why that is an important and meritorious contribution to our democratic culture. And so, but it's also in the service of isegoria, because everyone gets an equal chance to be promoted in that way. Everyone gets an equal chance to speak, but as we get more experience with what different people are saying, the people who other people feel are speaking most constructively, their words become more visible, even though everyone's words are ultimately visible.
Yeah, that's really interesting too, because a little bit off the topic of the social media sites, but it reminds me a little bit of Tucker Carlson. So Tucker Carlson in America is a very right-wing commentator, and he's sort of in this camp with Donald Trump and using language as a kind of way to rile people up and to kind of say the most outrageous things possible in some cases. But, in his early career, he was thought of as being quite moderate and was good friends with people like Rachel Maddow. Supposedly they were very close friends for a long time. And, he was always a conservative, but I remember when I was young hearing him speak about topics in a fairly middle of the road manner, still on the right. But as his career developed, he realized that on network TV, that this kind of constructed isegoria wasn't going to make him a lot of money or get him a lot of success. And so his career really veered away from that. And so we lived in this, he was in this society that just didn't value that. But that could imagine a different reality where we had some sort of media set up that would reward this kind of behavior that he sort of initially engaged in, and maybe would have, guided him in a different direction. But
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the mores, the general culture of politics all around the West, around about the time when I was a kid, was just much more conducive to that. Yeah. For instance, I remember a Conservative Prime Minister of Australia, a guy called Robert Menzies, the longest serving Prime Minister in Australia's history. My mother, who was, a voter, she wasn't terribly left-wing, she was left of centre, and this bloke drove her spare because he was a Conservative, and he was just quite effortless in batting away progressive left-of-centre views, and she thought of him as a man who sort of presided over Australia going to sleep. But when he retired, anyway, he was a Conservative. He was very well thought of by Australian business and Australian small business and all kinds of ordinary folk, everyday folk in Australia. And when he retired, he didn't even own his own house. And some wealthy people in Melbourne, where I live, put their hat round and bought him a house. Now compare that with a left of centre ex-president of yours, Barack Obama, who leaves office, signs a $60 million book deal, and his first action that I know about after leaving the White House was to go on holiday on Richard Branson's private island. So the values of these periods are really like chalk and cheese, and it's possible that someone like Tucker Carlson, or that this trajectory of someone like Tucker Carlson, might have made him more money even then, but it would have brought him a lot of, ordinary folk would shun him, would say that's really not what we're about. And again, we could maybe talk about this some other time, but I'm rather fascinated, without thinking we could possibly return to it. I'm rather fascinated. I think it's completely fascinating, this distinction that existed when I was a kid between amateur sport and professional sport, because it's carrying these cultural values, which is, don't get ahead of yourself. You might be the best tennis player in the world, and you'll make no money from it because you will have had a fantastic time. Everyone will know you. Everyone will be barracking for you. You'll represent your country. What could be more honourable than that? And then you'll go into life and get another job, and you will have had a fantastic time. But now the best sports people have all that and hundreds of millions of dollars and all kinds of other stuff, and everyone's obsessed with the money, and there seems to be so much less satisfaction and fulfillment for those people who don't quite make it to the top. So it's these are huge changes in our culture, and let me conclude on that point that you can't put them in a constitution. They're lived values. They're embodied in a society. They're emergent from within society. And that's something that I think the Athenians understood better than we do.
Yeah. It's this idea that, to kind of bring it back to our kind of idea of speech is that this relationship, there's an ethics of relating to one another that recognizes the responsibility of speaking, in that you also have to listen, or to place yourself in that larger network, I guess, of where this act of speech or this act of doing something in a career is taking place. So, I mean, I think that in some ways describes this fidelity concept we talked about. It's almost like there's this network that everyone sort of reads the same cues from, or follows the same, at least follows the same directions to some degree, and can therefore sort of figure out where their place in that system is a little bit better.
Yeah, well, all of these concepts here are relational concepts. And the idea of fidelity, the thing about, well, I suppose fidelity and isegoria are concepts which apply to the whole, but they apply in some kind of relational way. So in a polity, there are certain givens that you will be breaking faith with. I mean, the most obvious one is being traitorous to your country, but if you're in government and you serve yourself rather than, and you're a Supreme Court judge, or you're a senator, or a member of the House of Representatives, or whoever you are, and you use this position to advantage yourself, then that is a breach of faith. Everyone understands, and none of us are entirely spotless, but most of us are certainly I can speaking for myself, I'm a fair way from being traitorous, or I take questions of conflict of interest and all those things seriously, and but yeah, anyway, so that's. I don't think I'll try and finish this answer. I've said, well, I've already finished it. I've just better stop.
Well, let's. I want to talk a bit about merit, because that's our missing piece. And I think at one point you described parrhesia as being, speech in pursuit of merit, or something along these lines. Yeah.
Well, I think both one hopes both isegoria and parrhesia is speech in pursuit of merit. But let me give you two. I'll give you two snapshots, and I think I'll give you the logically clearest snapshot first, which is from Wikipedia. And so on Wikipedia, one of the things about our democracy is that we're very sentimental. Why is our democracy sentimental? Because sentiments are emotions, and if you're trying to move people, you use emotions, you don't use reason. And our democracy is sentimental about we the people. We're usually cast as the good guys. And so when something like Wikipedia turns up, or open source software, these are extraordinary things. Suddenly you get this new technology called the internet, and an encyclopedia starts writing itself. Well, that's a pretty surprising, everyone wants to know something about that, and they're pretty excited about it. And they see that Wikipedia is completely open and democratic in some sense. So that's what they fall in love with. They say, oh, can we have a Wikipedia of government? And so I was actually involved in this question because I chaired a thing called the Government 2.0 Task Force in Australia, which was asking what can governments learn from social media, from these what was then called Web 2 platforms, and so on. And I knew that there was something fishy about this, and the way I described it to myself is that the reason Wikipedia works is because of the neutral point of view. That is, people don't have to agree on whether George Bush, Donald Trump, or Barack Obama were good presidents, but they can agree on, well, I was going to say when they were born. In the case of Obama, you may get some dispute about where they were born. But I don't know what Wikipedia says about that, but I expect it's got the right answer. So that's now in government. Of course, government is an ought question. Government is about people saying we ought to impose a no-fly zone in Ukraine, or we ought not to. And that, of course, is something that reasonable people will continue to disagree with. So that's a much harder problem to solve. But I want to look more closely at Wikipedia, because if you just stick up a website and say, go for your lives, and that's kind of what people did in a bunch of different areas, nothing happens. People lose interest because there's kind of vandalism and anyone says anything, and why should anyone contribute to this? So my answer to why Wikipedia works is not that it was open. That just helps a lot. My answer to what is miraculous about Wikipedia and open source software is that it invents a new-ish kind of meritocracy. And this is a meritocracy which is a sort of it's a sort of bootstrapped meritocracy. A bunch of people set up shop and start doing stuff together. Over time, usually, and this is pretty fascinating, but usually most of these projects have what's called a benevolent dictator for life. Somebody, so with the Linus Torvalds sits at top of the benevolent dictator for life of Linux, and Jimmy Wales does the same for Wikipedia. So they're actually, but their job is to run a meritocracy, and the way the meritocracy works is roughly the way we were talking about the Segoria working in a democracy, which is you go in, you contribute, and as you contribute more, and as your peers recognize your contribution, you gain more status, more authority, and that's and so we've reinvented a new, more open, less bureaucratic and competitive form of meritocracy. And so, yeah, sorry, you go.
I mean, I think in the sense that the people at the top of, besides Jimmy Wales, the people who really have influence in Wikipedia have a lot of merit in theory, based on the principles of that platform.
Well, that's right. And there is and people would be right to say, well, hang on then, does Torvalds own Linux, and does Jimmy Wales own Wikipedia? In some sense they do, but only a copy of it. Because if they go crazy like King George III, someone can take the code, take the whole project and replicate it somewhere else, which is called to fork it. And there are plenty of forks of Wikipedia, and they've all died because Wikipedia has performed so well, and people end up going to Wikipedia if they want to contribute or if they want to read it. So this is and so it's the fact that they've got on top of the meritocracy question, which is a much harder problem to solve than the openness question. Openness is easy. You just build a platform and say, go for your life. Yeah. So that's the importance of that's the importance of merit, and that's one of the things that's just desperately lacking in our democracy. So let me give you an example of just one example of this. What we have in our democracy is a kind of inequality. Well, I won't go into ways in which we don't have equality of speech. We have equality of votes. Again, there's voter suppression, but everyone gets a vote. Now, think of these parties that are, I don't know whether you have the expression in America, but up there in the Westminster world, they're called crossbench parties. And they are parties which, like the Liberals in Canada, I think the Liberals are in government, but Canada's got three major parties. Australia's got two major parties, and it's got the Greens, and they will often hold the balance of power in one of the chambers. And in the United Kingdom, the Liberal Democrats had the balance of power. Now, if one of these balance of power, now the point of being a balance of power party is that you try to negotiate with the two parties to get better outcomes. Now, what we know about the electoral experience of these parties, in Australia, for instance, we had one of these parties, it was called the Australian Democrats, and it was before the Greens. And there was a period of time when they negotiated with the Conservative government about tax reform, and they did something which people, kind of didn't like. And what they, and they did it not because they liked it particularly, but because they got a lot of value for agreeing to that thing. But I think you don't need to have lived through that experience to kind of believe me when I say that once any of these trigger points were hit in an election campaign, they went down the toilet, and that also happened to the Liberal Democrats. So what I'm getting at is that that what happens in the chamber, what happens in these negotiations, are very difficult judgments of costs and benefits, and you're trying to get the best you can, but then electoral politics doesn't work like that. Electoral politics works in slogans. So we don't have this gradation of merit, which is the sort of thing that the conservative philosopher, the kind of founder of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke, looking at the French Revolution, but before then he was a member of Parliament, and he said, your member of Parliament owes you their judgment ahead of owing you their vote. And what he meant was you work out whether you trust me or not. You're the one who's got to do the voting. And then you send me to Westminster in London, and I will do my best. And I hope you will trust me. And if you don't, of course, you can vote me out. But what we've got in our modern sense of politics is a much thinner notion of accountability, or as we talked about a number of weeks ago, a kind of notion of flattery, in which I'm going to represent you, I'm going to find out what you think, and I'm going to take it to Westminster. The problem with that is you can't take what someone thinks to Westminster because, yes, you know they value this, this, and this, and when you get to Westminster, you have to make choices and you have to try and do the best you can for your constituents. So the way in which we've run our democracy has destroyed the whole point of having representatives, which is to have specialists in areas and try to get the best compromises between different interests.
Yeah, well, very interesting. Yeah, I think that that term gradation of merit, I think, is a really interesting one to think about. You know, how does this? It's very easy to visualize. You know, whether it exists in particular situations or where it doesn't exist. So, like when I think of Wikipedia, I can sort of see it. When I think of Twitter, I can't see it. Somehow.
That's right. Absolutely. That's the problem.
It's a nice sort of, I don't know, maybe it's a sign that there's a system in place that's approaching what you've described here, or, like some sort of, and then certainly in politics, that's a whole nother story. But like whether or not people are really acting out what it is, the priorities of what would be meritorious according to the thinking and the speech of the people who are being represented in these assemblies.
Yeah, that's a hard problem to solve, and we're not even trying to solve it. We're just saying, well, we'll just use votes and campaigning and slogans, and that's the way we deal with those kinds of things. I've just had an exchange with someone about this, which I sent you to, Peyton, and I'll put in the show notes, where someone was complaining of being thrown off Twitter, and I said to him, I'm very sympathetic. I don't think you should have been thrown off Twitter at all. But the problem is that it doesn't have this gradation of merit, that Twitter's not set up for that, and it would be costly for Twitter to even try and do it, and Twitter's just trying to make a profit ultimately. So that's our, these are the problems of contemporary politics, and to come full circle to where we started, just starting another platform, another social platform, and committing it to free speech is just setting ourselves up to learn the same lesson that we are being taught right now without actually getting to a more mature place. It's going to be hard work, but that's what we have to do. Yeah.
Well, that's, I think, a good challenge for the future. Maybe Elon Musk will want to take it on. Who knows? But in any case, it's been great talking once again. And I think we didn't even talk about this, but we have lots to talk about.
We'll have to do it next week, maybe.
Put
it up as a teaser.
Yeah. So the discussion of what's a shared and a private purpose. What does that mean? And also, what do we mean by public and private, shared and private spheres? So I think these are really interesting ideas, and I'm very curious to see how that relates to the diagram that we've been talking about.
Yes, it does. It does even. So that's good.
All right, then. Well, hope everyone enjoyed this. And if you have any thoughts about this, please leave comments on YouTube, or you can email or reach us at these places. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Peyton.
And talk soon.